Hello and welcome to this Pokemon VGC team building guide for the season of 2021, or is it 2022? I don't know at this point how the numbers are quite working. First and foremost, my name is Terence. I've been a Pokemon player since the end of the 2012 season. At that time, I was living in a country that didn't have any tournaments. So my first IRL event was UK Nationals 2014, where I finished 10th place that year, using the Victory Bell of all Pokemon. And I've attended many events since then as well. So I've seen a lot of people asking in the comments on YouTube videos and in other players' streams about team building tips. So I thought I'd make this guide. This guide isn't just for beginners, it can be for veteran players as well. Even if you know how to team build, maybe you just want another perspective. Well, hopefully this video can give you that. So I'm thinking that this guide will probably be in two parts, two videos. First one is of course this one. We're talking about the theory and methodology of team building. And the second video will be a team building session with my own commentary, giving my thoughts and a rundown of what I'm doing as I'm creating the team. And of course the team will also be featured on my Crack the Meta series as well. In the future, I may upload both videos together, but there's so much information that I just thought this would be an easier way to digest everything. And you don't have to watch both videos if you don't want to. You can watch this one if you're happy with what you've learned. You don't have to watch the second. Totally up to you. So first and foremost, this is not the de facto Pokemon guide. Yes, I know in the title it says it's the ultimate Pokemon team building guide. The truth is, there is no wrong way to build a team. There are many ways to do this. What we're going to cover here are lessons applicable, in my opinion, across all formats. So it's not just for this series. These are things that I've seen over the years of playing VGC, and these lessons have applied to each and every season, and all kinds of team building styles as well. So yeah, the title says ultimate, but if I didn't mention that there's no wrong way to build a team, it wouldn't be very ultimate of me, right? So that's how we're justifying that. So let's take a look at what we will be discussing today. So here's an overview of what we'll be covering today. Parts 1 and 2 will be covering theory. Parts 3 and 4 will be looking at the methodology. So let's jump straight into part 1. The essence of competitive Pokemon. So I know what you're thinking. Why is he telling me about competitive Pokemon? I already know this. I came here to build a team. He doesn't need to tell me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But there are some key principles I want to quickly cover because we can keep these in mind to help us work towards our goal when we are team building. So, at their core, competitive Pokemon battles are about depleting the opposition's resources, hit points, and ultimately a number of Pokemon while preserving your own. So it's resource management. So far, so straightforward. So due to the nature of the game, there are a number of variables that the player may have to consider on any given turn. As a result, a player's success is largely determined by their capacity to manage probability. So, yeah, on any given turn of Pokemon, many things can transpire. There's so many factors that come into play. So, examples of factors that can affect the outcome of a single turn of a battle. You've got your mind games. On every single turn of a battle, there are mind games going on. What's your opponent going to do? What do you want to do? Do they know what you want to do? Then we have inaccurate moves. So you can choose to run all 100% accurate moves, or you can choose to run some inaccurate moves. You can trade accuracy for power, your choice. But then these are factors that then work into the game as well. Damage rolls. So for newer players who may not necessarily be aware of this, apart from one or two specific exceptions, Pokemon moves do not deal set damage every time you use them. There's slight variables to it. So for example, if your Pokemon has 200 HP and it gets hit with a move and it takes 98 of its hit points down, so you've got 102 left, you can't say with certainty if your Pokemon can actually take another one of those hits, because 98 to 102, that's only 4 points. So it could be that the first hit was a lower damage roll and the next one could be a little bit higher as well. So again, damage rolls is also can affect the outcome of a turn as well. And of course, you've got the luck factor as well, or the hacks as people call it. So your critical hits, things like flinching, status, sleep turns specifically, paralysis coming out from Thunder Wave, or getting fully paralyzed, or getting paralyzed for Thunderbolt, 10% chance. Being frozen is always a horrible one because there's no way to directly inflict that status off the top of my head. And speed ties as well, you know, maybe your Pokemon and the opposing Pokemon exactly the same speed, and it's a coin flip as to who's going to move first. Then there are your opponent's item choices and their move choices as well. These are factors that you cannot control. But for example, in a best of 3 where team sheets are not open, so you can't see your opponent's sets before a game, you may be having to make calculated guesses as to where items may be on their Pokemon. You may be having to spore a Pokemon that you think may have safety goggles. Maybe you won't spore that slot just in case. Again, these are all things that come into play. Same for the move choices as well. One good example of this was during this series, Series 10, a lot of Zacian were not running Play Rough in the beginning, and then I remember a few weeks ago, it started to pop up more and more and more. During that transition period, you're playing sometimes, you're thinking, does this Zacian have Play Rough? Can it hit my Dark types or my Dragon types for super effective damage? Again, you can't control these, but these are all things that you have to consider and can affect the outcome of a turn. So just to reiterate that final sentence of this point, as a result, a player's success is largely determined by their capacity to manage probability, and that is absolutely key. So why should you team build? First and foremost, building your own team can go a long way towards aiding you in managing those probabilities that you feel are most important to maximize control over. So as we mentioned before already, inaccurate moves. Are you happy to use inaccurate moves on your team sometimes? Take that trade of accuracy for power. Are you happy to roll those dice? If so, then you can create a team, you can throw some of those moves on. If you're like me and you really dislike inaccurate moves, then you're probably going to go for the slightly weaker versions. You're going to use Flamethrower over Fire Blast if you feel like you can get away with having that slightly lower power. Another massive one for me is status as well. Like I mentioned before, on many of my teams, I use Tapu Fini because it's just a great bulky water type Pokemon, but also has the added benefit of Misty Terrain. So you just switch it in. I don't want to be messing about with Sleep Powder, Spore, Paralysis. If I can minimize that as much as I can, then I'm going to do it. It all comes down to you as an individual. So by building yourself, you can choose to better manage those probabilities that you feel are important for you to have that control over. Team building yourself can also expand your game knowledge by exposing you to the stats, abilities, and moves of lesser used Pokemon. So let's use the restricted format as an example. Maybe you're playing a Groudon team. Groudon, not super common like Zacian or Calyrex, but has risen in usage and has been popular throughout the years. VGC prior, when it has been legal. You probably know Groudon's base speed is 90, has a base speed stat of 90. What happens if you play against a Reshiram, for example? You don't see Reshiram too often. If you are familiar with Reshiram, you would know it also has a base speed of 90. So if you're running max speed Groudon and you see Reshiram, instead of being like, oh, I don't know what's going on here, maybe I'm going to get outsped, I have no idea how fast Reshiram is. You can have some comfort knowing that at the very worst, unless it's got a choice scarf, you're going to speed tie. You're going to speed tie with the Reshiram. And this is a great example because Groudon beats Reshiram quite easily, but Reshiram also beats Groudon quite easily as well, since Groudon sets up the sun and it has incredibly strong fire type moves. Speaking of moves, there are lots of great moves in the game, and they're not necessarily exclusive to great Pokemon. For example, what do Volcarona, Amoonguss, and Butterfree have in common? There are 3 Pokemon in this format that can learn Rage Powder. There's a 4th one though, Tangrowth. So if you see a Tangrowth, which I have, I think once in the last year that I've been playing, you know, hang on a minute, this is a Pokemon that gets Rage Powder. This has redirection. So you won't get surprised by these Pokemon. And lastly, we mentioned abilities. So, funny story, speaking of Reshiram, I took Reshiram to a tournament in 2018 and we were about halfway through the Swiss rounds. I was playing this guy, he had a Xerneas team and he had Heatran on his team, and Heatran's ability is Flash Fire, so it takes no damage from fire type moves. In fact, it powers up its own fire type moves. And I had Groudon Reshiram, so I was firing off these really powerful fire moves in the sun. And in game 2, I was already 1 game up. In game 2, he switches in his Heatran, and in his mind, and in my mind as well, because I also forgot this, I was thinking, oh, that's a great switch, that's a really, really good switch. Both of us forgot Reshiram's ability is Turbo Blaze, which ignores opposing Pokemon's abilities. And Heatran took, I think, 70% damage from my Reshiram's Heat Wave. It was basically a dead slot for my opponent from that point onwards. Again, if you can team build yourself, you can become familiar with these abilities and what certain Pokemon can and can't do. And lastly, it can be incredibly rewarding. So I haven't mentioned this already, but I was inspired to make this video by Wolf Glick, because he put a video out about a year ago where he talked about team building. He didn't go into too much practical detail, but he talked a lot about the theory as well. I'm echoing quite a lot of what he's saying. It was a really, really great video. I'll put that in the description below if you want to check that out too. And I was really quite pleased that he brought this point up to something I have felt as well. Team building is a form of self-expression. You know, you're creating something from scratch, and that may not necessarily be for everyone. I think most people have a creative side to them in one way or another. For people like me, and for many others as well, it's fun to team build, especially when you create something and it's effective and you're winning games with it. It's an awesome feeling. So with that said, let's move on to part 2. Okay, so proactive versus reactive teams. Let's have a look. In spite of ever-changing rule sets and the coming and going of different mechanics, VGC teams over the years have always fallen somewhere on a spectrum, bookended by 2 distinct builds: the proactive team and the reactive team. So while not necessarily mutually exclusive, there are specific characteristics that can generally be seen in each of these team builds, and we will discuss those on the upcoming slides. Where your ideal team falls on that spectrum is down to you as an individual. You may prefer the more structured, premeditated blitzing style of proactive teams. You may prefer turn-by-turn reactive play, or you may be comfortable with either style. I highly recommend you get to grips with both in practice. So let's look at our proactive teams first. A proactive team is centered around a specific strategy that, if executed successfully, is incredibly difficult for the opponent to overcome. We have the example here of Kyogre Tornadus teams. They've been popular ever since Kyogre and Tornadus have been available to play in VGC. So the Pokemon that make up these teams are generally specialists that facilitate the team strategy through their supportive abilities, move pools, and strong offensive synergy. For example, moves such as Fake Out, redirection moves, and abilities like Psychic Surge, Queenie Majesty, the list goes on. I mean, if we look at this team actually, you can see you've got Kyogre, incredibly strong as a restricted. It gets Drizzle, so it powers up its water type moves. You've got Tornadus, which is there mainly for speed control. Get your Tailwind up, get your Kyogre outspeeding everything. Regieleki, secondary form of speed control, and also deals damage against opposing Kyogre and Tornadus teams. You've got Water Urshifu. Urshifu always scoring critical hits. Again, its water moves powered up by the rain. Serena blocks Fake Out and also, again, helps to counter opposing Kyogre. Rillaboom sets up grassy terrain so you can grassy glide into opposing Kyogre as well. And of course, Serena blocking grassy glides coming in, blocking any priority moves coming in to the Kyogre. So all these Pokemon are specialized in some way to facilitate the strategy and just wipe out the opposing team. So with these kinds of teams, heading into any battle, you already know what you want to do. So Team Preview is used to assess your opponent's potential counterplays, and you choose 4 Pokemon based on what you feel will have the best chance of executing your strategy. And some typical examples in the current format include, as we mentioned, Kyogre Tornadus, Xerneas, and dedicated Trick Room teams, for example, the Mental Herb Mimikyu ones with Ice Rider Calyrex. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it is a spectrum. So some teams really do commit to a strategy. Other teams have pretty good defensive synergy, so they can switch around and delay their strategy, weather any storm that's coming, get through it, and then set up, which I'd say Xerneas typically falls under. So the pros and cons of proactive teams. First off, the pros. So generally intuitive to pick up and play effectively. So you only need to see a couple of games to get an understanding of what these particular teams are about. They're very difficult to counter outright and can steamroll through unprepared teams. Again, Koga Tornado's prime example of this. You see people on the ladder, on Showdown, on Battle Spot, just flying through the ranks, trying to get up to Master Ball, trying to get the high elo ranks, using this team because a lot of players not prepared for it, just wipes them out. It's not as mentally draining to play as reactive teams, especially in a tournament setting. This is really important for me. In my opinion, regional events are incredibly long, at least with internationals, and in the past nationals not as much, but internationals especially. There's a real atmosphere about them that can help you get through the day. You're feeling quite pumped up throughout the day. Regionals, not necessarily the case. 8-9 Swiss rounds, 11-12 hours stuck in a hall. Best of 3, of course. For me, it wears me out. It really does. It depends on the player. Depends on you as an individual. With these kinds of teams, the battles can be quite short. So you're either going to knock out your opponent's Pokemon fairly quickly, or you're probably going to get countered and you're going to fall pretty quickly as well. So that's a benefit for sure. And these teams can somewhat alleviate the skill gap between the user and high level opponents. So this is quite contentious, so I'll elaborate on this. So of course, all teams require skill to play. Every turn of a battle requires some degree of deliberation, but typically these kinds of teams are fairly linear in their playstyle. So you already have your goal in mind. Generally, it's your opponent that's trying to figure you out more than you are trying to figure them out. And cons. So it can be fairly shallow and one-dimensional in their play style. As such, they're easier to predict than reactive teams, and they can struggle against teams with dedicated counter plays. So I'm going to kind of talk about all those together. One thing I've been doing on my channel thus far, if you've checked out my teams, my early videos, I've worked to counter these teams as best as I can, which is Manual Sun. So that's my dedicated counterplay. I have Prankster, Sunny Day. Because I have Prankster, Sunny Day, and I know my opponent's going to get Koga on the field at some point, 100%. They get it on, I set up Sunny Day. They're not dealing the damage they want to be dealing. I've disrupted their strategy. So it's very easy for me to predict what they're going to do next. They need to switch out their Kyogre. Some players have started to opt to run Rain Dance on Tornadus. But if you're running, for example, Sableye or Liepard, a dark type that can't be taunted and is also slower than Tornadus, you're always going to get the Sun Up over their Rain. So they have to switch out. So you know that it's probably the Serena that's coming in, or the Rillaboom, because they either want to block Fake Outs coming in once they get set up with the Serena, or they want to use the Rillaboom to start dealing extra damage as well. And because of that, you can just target that slot freely with a fire move more often than not, and you're going to get the knockout. Very easy to predict. Of course, you get to higher skill levels, players switch things up a little bit. Not quite as easy, but still easier to predict than reactive teams for sure. Speaking of our reactive teams. So reactive teams have no specific overarching strategy, instead relying on a mixture of potent attacks, good defensive plays, and both supportive and disruptive moves to outmaneuver and ultimately beat down the opposition team throughout the battle. We have the Zacian team as an example here. I started making this presentation a few weeks back. At this point, the Urshifu should be a Landorus. That's very much taken over on these archetypes now. And the defining characteristics of these teams usually include a bulky Firewater Grass core, Intimidate, Speed Control, and elements of the Fantasy core. So let's quickly talk about those for newer players. Firewater Grass core, so a fire type, a water type, and a grass type. The basics of Pokemon. Pokemon 101. Really good offensive and defensive synergy. You have Intimidate, which is always omnipresent on just about any type of team. These teams especially value it quite a lot, because again, it's all about powering down your opponent while trying to maintain a dominant position yourself. Speed control. So these teams usually have multiple methods to do this. It's generally tailwind with either icy wind and electro web, or it'll be tailwind with trick room. Generally speaking, some teams have all three as well. And then we have the fantasy core. So that's your steel, dragon, fairy. So it's not always the full core of these three, but steel types have always been a mainstay on these kinds of teams. In this format, you have Zacian. It's really the only steel type you need on this team. But in past formats, you would see at least one per team. Sometimes you'd see 2 steel types on a team. Fake out and moves that allow for switching mid-turn, so U-turn, parting shot, etc., are often used to facilitate getting the correct combination of Pokemon on the field on any given turn. So in my opinion, this mass usage of switching moves is a fairly recent development in VGC over the last few years. They've always been around, but I feel like, again, purely in my opinion, these moves have become more accessible to more Pokemon. A lot of those Pokemon are really quite strong as well. And of course, we had Incineroar come along with Sun and Moon, and the move Parting Shot as well, which is just a fantastic move in general. So these teams work to employ these moves to disrupt the opponent with Fake Out, and then to switch out so that at the beginning of the next turn, they are maintaining the dominant position. And examples of reactive teams in the current format include typical Zacian teams and Eternatus teams. There's not really a typical Eternatus team. There was one doing the rounds fairly recently, but there's no Eternatus team like there is a mainstay Zacian team at the moment. Next up, the pros and cons of reactive teams. So first, our pros. They're very well rounded and adaptable, with potential answers to most situations you may find yourself in. So these teams, they employ Pokemon with generally high base stat totals that have really good defensive synergy, and generally have an answer amongst them for most situations. Because of this, they are incredibly difficult to outright counter. They have longevity, and they can continually reset board position over the course of a single battle. As I mentioned with the defensive synergy, it can be very difficult to knock these Pokemon out, especially if they're not staying on the field, because players of these kinds of teams, they play them quite intelligently, and they don't give up their pieces easily. And these kinds of teams can also force the opposition to misplay. So again, I'm going to elaborate here, because anyone can misplay against any team. But as I just mentioned, high-level players of these teams generally play very intelligently, and they make those defensive switches. But they also know when to take a risk and not pull the obvious switch, which can cause their opponent to overextend and maybe get their Pokemon knocked out in return, take a lot of damage in return as well. And lastly, these teams can incorporate techs and or micro strategies of their own, so things like Trick Room, maybe one Trick Room setter and a slow Pokemon as well. These variations happen over time with these teams and are a response to popular trends in the meta. And our cons of reactive teams, they're generally not as intuitive to pick up and play as proactive teams. They can be mentally taxing to play as well, especially in a best of 3 tournament setting. Again, purely personal preference. And before we move on as well, I call these reactive teams. They're not necessarily reactive, it's more like proactive reaction. Players will, again, play intelligently, they will try to maintain ball position, they'll try and read what the opposition is going to do, and then work their way around that so that they maintain that dominant position. So it's reactive, but in a kind of a proactive sense. They're not chasing the game. So what now? Get familiar with both styles. So even if you're not great with one style or the other, or you're on that spectrum, maybe your ideal team fills quite a small gap on that spectrum, still play those other teams. Learn how they work and what can counter them, because you will be playing against those teams as well. So, what's popular? let's talk about the meta. So get familiar with what is popular in the meta. Watch others play. So you can do this on Pokemon Showdown, the high elo ratings especially. Watch streamers, watch YouTubers play. You can also use rental codes and just play yourself. Identify the most popular trends, so which Pokemon are being used, which moves are particularly popular, which items keep popping up. Ask yourself why they are so common as well. So once you feel you have sufficient knowledge, you can use it to get an idea of what Pokemon and combinations you feel would work best for you. So yeah, you see something, you go, that looks really cool. I think I would quite enjoy playing that, and then play it. For me personally, in this format, I really like Eternatus teams. I haven't even made one yet, but I quite like how it plays. So I think I'll give that a go at some point for sure. You can also try to isolate key features present across the meta and look for potential holes in those features. So emphasis on the try here, because this is maybe where I differ from some players. Of course, you know, this is my methods that I use. Other players may use different methods. Other players may use something very similar. All down to you as an individual again. So what do I mean by this? So for example, we've already mentioned Intimidate being incredibly popular, always has been. Certain teams using Intimidate to switch in and out, using Incineroar as their pivot. It's what it's on teams to do. So maybe you go, okay, I want to disrupt that, because if I can disrupt that, I can disrupt my opponent's overall strategy and their most comfortable play style. Let's throw my low tick in with competitive. Let's put in some defined Pokemon or something like this. We have fake out spam as well. So we've already seen this happen in this series. Fake out spam everywhere. Of course, again, Incineroar everywhere, Rillaboom everywhere, Mienshao started popping up as well. There are quite a few fake out Pokemon at this point. And then you start to see the rise of inner focus Pokemon, the three legendary dogs from the Johto region, and sometimes Dragonite as well. You see it popping up with inner focus, whereas in the past it was always Marvel Scale, I forget which one, Marvel Scale I think. And then we have one of my personal favourites, lack of protect on common mons. So what I mean by this is not always something that's necessarily evident in a particular metagame. But in this one, Incineroar doesn't carry protect. Incineroar never has carry protect since its inception, pretty much. But it doesn't carry protect. 99% of the time, you can attack into the Incineroar slot, and if you move before the Incineroar does, you're going to hit whatever's in that slot, be it the Incineroar or the Incineroar switching out. So you don't have to worry about it protecting. And then you've got Rillaboom to a lesser degree, which is carrying an Assault Vest quite often, but every now and again you see one pop up with protect. But generally you can say, oh, here's a Rillaboom, I can attack into that slot, my opponent probably can't stop me getting some damage off on that side. And finally, the team building process, what we're all here for. So use the Pokemon Showdown Team Builder to begin constructing your team. Start with your core idea and expand from there. We will go into more detail about this in the next video, but I will be showing these resources in just a moment as well. So check your damage calcs on a damage calculator as you build. As a side note, this comes a lot further down the line, but I just mentioned this now. Look for stat conflicts between team members. For example, it's going to be your speed stat that you're looking at here. You may have two Pokemon that have the same speed. For example, Tapu Fini and Rillaboom are both base 85. They both set terrain, so they will clash with each other if you're going to lead them together, if ever you're going to end up doing that. You want to make sure you have certainty on which Pokemon is faster, which terrain will always overwrite the other terrain, rather than sending them out both with the same speed stat and just being a coin flip every single time. Peakalytics is an absolutely incredible resource as well, which we will look at in just a moment. 100% use Peakalytics when you are team building. And a couple of optional things. So keep a team planner open to keep track of the team's weaknesses, resistances, and immunities. And lastly, you don't have to team build alone. Some players like to team build alone, other players actually have really good success when team building with friends. So give it a go. If you have friends also interested in team building, work together, see what you can come up with. So if we have a quick look at Pokemon Showdown first, so you're probably familiar with this website, but for newer players, let's have a quick look. Go straight into your team builder, and of course on this website you can practice with your team as well. But for team building, go to the team builder, select your format, add a Pokemon, and it's a really incredible tool. You can see you get the Pokemon's base stat totals here. You've got the abilities of the Pokemon, the typings, everything. You can sort by speed, by special attack, by all the stats, base stat total as well. And you can search by abilities, by moves as well. For example, let's say I'm looking for a Prankster Pokemon. And I'm looking specifically for a Prankster Pokemon that learns Quash. There we go. The only one is Sableye. Sableye is the only Prankster Pokemon with Prankster and Quash. Rather than having to manually look through every single Pokemon yourself, you can use the team builder to help you in that regard. As a quick side note, personal preference for me, if I find a Pokemon that I quite like the looks of on Showdown, I actually look on Cerebi at that Pokemon. The reason being is I just like this layout a lot. It gives you all of the weaknesses here and resistances as well. But I like the way it presents all of the moves. So you've got your standard level up moves, you've got your TM moves, your TRs, egg moves, tutor moves. I like this particular format when I'm looking at what other moves a Pokemon can learn. Again, that's only me though. While we're on the subject of Cerebi, of course you can find this type chart on other websites as well. It's pretty freely available, but get to know your type chart. You don't have to study it like you're studying for a maths exam, but as you're playing the game, you'll pick this up fairly quickly. You can even keep it open while you're practicing if you have to. Next up, we have Pikalytics, a really incredible resource. So they take the usage stats from Pokemon Showdown, so you can see the percentage of teams a particular Pokemon is on. If we use Incineroar as our example, you can search up here, but we're just going to click on Incineroar. Oh, he's already here. What am I doing? He's already here. So it tells you all of the base stats, and then it tells you the moves, the most used moves, and the percentage. So 99.583% of Incineroar are running Fake Out. I'm surprised it's not 100%, honestly. That still seems too low. But you can see, it's incredible, really great resource. Teammates, its most common teammates as well. So if you have a Pokemon you like the looks of, say you like the looks of Zacian, and you say, oh, but I don't know what Pokemon I should pair with Zacian, just come straight onto here. You've got your moves already, just pick the top 4. Look at the teammates, pick the next 5. What do we have? Rillaboom, Incineroar, Regieleki, Urshifu Rapid Strike, so that's the water type, and Landorus. Just do that, just chuck them on, see how it goes. If there's anything you want to change, then change it afterwards. And then you have the items, what items they're holding, their abilities. So again, let's go to Incineroar for that one. Let's go to Rillaboom. Let's do something a bit different. We can see the percentage of items held. So 80% of Rillabooms on Pokemon Showdown are running the Assault Vest. Then you have a couple of Miracle Seed and the rare Choice Band and their abilities. 99.925% running Grassy Surge. 0.075% of players forget to switch their ability over from Overgrowth, apparently, which happens. And then EV Spreads. So again, if you don't know EV Spreads, just grab one. Just grab one from here. Really great resource. Really great. And we're not even done there either. We're not finished there. You can see up here, we have a team builder. So you can team build on this website as well. Damage calculator as well. You can't build a team without this. And there are other calculators. I think they're all made by the same guy, but this one is the most comprehensive, in my opinion. It's so good. And they have a lot of sets already in the calculator as well. So we have Incineroar, the Picolytics set. And you can see, and people will generally be running something similar to these sets because they will go onto this website, they'll go into the damage calculators, and they will grab these sets because they know that they're probably not too bad. Last but not least, I mentioned have a look at a team planner. So Picolytics has a team planner as well. I just like this one. And I say it's optional because it's not actually super important. I like to look at my team's resistance and weaknesses. On the face of it, you may think, oh, that's incredibly important. And it is important, but let me explain why it's not the most important thing or necessarily as important as you might think it is. If we look at this team, as we mentioned before, very well rounded. It covers for everything. Yeah, everything is covered. With the exception of 3 ground weaknesses on this particular version of this team. 1, 2, 3. You've got 1 resist, you've got 1 immunity, so it's pretty well covered, to be honest. So again, don't be thrown off by this number here. And even if you didn't have a flying type, let's imagine you don't have Landorus on this team, and you have something else that takes neutral damage from ground, you still have to take into account what ground moves are your team going up against, which Pokemon, and can they handle them. Most common ground moves in the format is going to be Earth Power, the strongest of which is going to be coming from this Pokemon right here. Can this team deal with Landorus? Zacian can. Of course, Pokemon are not played in a vacuum, they're played with other Pokemon and other factors on the field. But Zacian can beat Landorus one-on-one and should really beat Landorus one-on-one in most cases. Suicune as well, very bulky, so it can take a hit and it can knock out if you're carrying Ice Beam, just 1-hit KO, do a lot of damage with Scald. And Rillaboom deals a lot of damage to it as well. So while this number may seem a little bit high, do you really have to worry about taking too much damage from ground types for this team? I would say not necessarily. And lastly, things to remember. So when team building, always keep in mind that speed is king. What I don't mean by this is just use the fastest Pokemon and you'll win. Of course, that's not the case. If a Pokemon's very fast, then it's probably having to trade off in either power or bulk. You do get hyper offensive Pokemon, you do get hyper offensive teams. What I mean by this is keep in mind what speed common Pokemon are, if they're particularly fast like Zacian and Calyrex. Keep in mind if you're running Trick Room, the base speed of your own Pokemon in Trick Room. Keep in mind the speed of your Pokemon or even particular threats that after you hit them with an Icy Wind, do your Pokemon then outspeed? So these are all things you need to consider. In Tailwind, if you get Tailwind up, are you outspeeding all the threats you need to be outspeeding? You know, if you're knocking out your opponent's Pokemon before they're knocking you out, you're going to win. If you're using Rock Slide before your opponent's using Rock Slide, they are the ones that have the chance to flinch, not you. So speed is very much king when team building. Next, don't refuse to use a Pokemon just because it's popular. This is such a bad mentality to have. I know some Pokemon can seem quite annoying. You're like, oh, they're everywhere. Incineroar's everywhere. I hate Incineroar. I like to use lesser used Pokemon as well, but not just because they're lesser used Pokemon, but because I feel like there's a niche for them in the meta, and I see that potential. But because of that, I also understand the potential that everyone else sees in these popular picks. If you look at the teams on the channel so far, Incineroar's been around as well. It's the best generalist in the game. Most players would totally agree with that statement as well, I believe. So don't refuse to use a Pokemon just because it's popular. Don't hamper yourself just because you don't want to use something. At the very least, give it a try and see if it works out for you. On the flip side, don't be afraid to experiment because a Pokemon is bad or not meta. So let's use the example. Let's go with something really obscure. You've got Venusaur. Are there any other Chlorophyll users that are Grass Poison type in the format? Off the top of my head, I can't remember what Pokemon are available, but I know that Vileplume is available and it fills that role as well. What's the difference between Venusaur and Vileplume? Venusaur is slightly bulkier, has much better coverage, it gets Earth Power, it gets Weather Ball as well. Vileplume does not get those moves, it's much slower, it can still outspeed Calyrex in Sun, I believe, but it is much slower, Again, slightly less bulky. It's slightly stronger though. Slightly stronger. Base 110 special attack, I believe, compared to Venusaur's 100. And is there anything it can do that Venusaur cannot? Again, I don't know everything off the top of my head, but I know it gets access to both Moonblast and Dazzling Gleam. So is there some team out there that's a Groudon team or has Torkoal, has a Venusaur on it, that needs that extra little bit of fairy coverage against dark types? There probably is. There probably is. The majority of the time, Venusaur is going to be the better Pokemon for you. But there are certain teams, certain scenarios where these other Pokemon can really shine. And the more you get along in team building a team, the more you can recognize these gaps that you need filled, and that's when you can really start experimenting with other things. So don't be afraid to give bad Pokemon a try. What's the worst that can happen? It doesn't work out, you switch back, it's fine. Next, you cannot cover for everything. I wish someone had told me this back when I started playing, because this cost me some good finishes. A very good finish in one tournament. This cost me because it seems obvious to me now, but back then I didn't realize this. You know, you cannot cover for everything. So you can spend lots of time team building. You'll make this team. You're still going to lose. You are going to lose. It's the nature of the game. Everyone loses at some point in Pokemon. And it brings me to this quote from my good friend Ben Kiriakou. So he always says to me, the goal of team building is not to try to plug every hole, but to choose where you are most comfortable with those holes being. So you're always going to have holes in your team. In team building, like we mentioned way back at the beginning of the presentation, you choose where those holes are. You can choose what's easy for you to deal with, and then things that are more difficult for your team to deal with, but you may feel more comfortable playing against, then you can move those holes over to there. You can say, oh, I'm happy to try to play around this particular strategy, this particular Pokemon. And last but not least, the meta is constantly evolving, so expect to rework your team from time to time. You might find that after a couple of weeks your team is not quite as effective. The meta is always changing, and it doesn't mean you have to throw away everything you've done. Have a look at your team. You can change sets, you can change moves, you can change the Pokemon as well. Just know that this is totally normal in the team building process. And that brings us to the end of the team building guide, well, chapter 1 at least. I hope you guys found this informative. Let me know if you did. If there's anything that you feel I should cover, you'd like me to cover, or any questions, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, guys.